In mid-August 2002, the residents of the small town of Woodland Hills, Colorado, began noticing the strange absence of Laura Black and local businessman Tom Henderson. Their sudden disappearance sparked a wave of gossip and suspicion among the neighbors, marking the beginning of a mystery that would shake the entire town. Summer 2002, Woodland Hills, Colorado. Nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, this small town was known for its quiet, almost idyllic atmosphere. It was home to Mark and Laura Black, who appeared to be the epitome of a successful and happy couple. Mark Black, a 40-year-old man with graying temples, was known for his diligence and hard work. He worked as an accountant at a local firm, which served a small but steady stream of clients. To many of the town's residents, he was a symbol of reliability and integrity. Mark always appeared impeccable, in a business suit, neatly trimmed, and with a constant smile on his face. However, behind this exterior of stability, Mark hid an inner anxiety that he kept even from himself. His wife, 35-year-old Laura Black, was the complete opposite of her husband. Energetic and cheerful, she attracted the attention of everyone who knew her. Laura worked at a local gallery, organizing exhibitions and cultural events. Her charming smile and vibrant style always made her the center of attention at any gathering. To many residents of Woodland Hills, Laura was the embodiment of success and confidence. The Black's neighbor, Walter Green, was an elderly widower who had lived next door for over 30 years. He was a retired psychologist who had left his practice a few years earlier after the death of his wife. Walter was known for his wisdom and kindness, and many townsfolk turned to him for advice. Despite his age, he maintained a sharp mind and was always ready to help with a word of wisdom or simply chat on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The first signs of trouble in Mark and Laura's relationship appeared in July 2002. Laura started staying late at work more frequently, citing urgent matters at the gallery. Whereas she used to return home by 6 in the evening, her returns were now getting later and later. At first, Mark didn't think much of it, attributing it to her hard-working nature. However, he soon noticed that Laura began leaving on weekends more often, claiming personal errands that she preferred not to discuss. Each time Mark asked her about it, Laura gave evasive answers, saying it was just work meetings or outings with friends. However, her explanations seemed increasingly unconvincing. Mark started noticing that Laura was becoming more secretive, often hiding her phone and taking calls in another room. Her behavior grew more mysterious and irritable. Being a rational person who liked to plan everything, Mark began to feel that something was amiss. He started having unsettling dreams, and soon an obsessive feeling took hold of him that Laura was hiding something. These suspicions gradually began to erode his inner peace. He started waking up in the middle of the night, consumed with worry, and found it difficult to fall back asleep. Before long, sleepless nights became the norm for him. Gradually, the voice in Mark's head grew louder, convincing him that Laura was leading a double life. These thoughts became more and more intrusive, and finding no other way out, Mark decided to uncover the truth himself. August 2002. One evening, Mark noticed that Laura had left her phone on the kitchen table while she went to shower. This was a rare opportunity. Mark's heart pounded as he picked up her phone. Two emotions fought within him, fear and curiosity. He knew that if he found something suspicious, his life would never be the same. After scrolling through a few messages, Mark came across a conversation with someone named Tom Henderson. The messages were filled with flirtation and innuendos, leaving no doubt Laura was having an affair. Tom Henderson turned out to be a successful local businessman, the owner of a construction company who had recently divorced and was now leading an active social life. It seemed that Laura and Tom had been carrying on a romance for several months. Every message Mark read felt like a knife to his heart. It turned out they had been meeting in various places, from secluded restaurants to cozy hotels outside of town. Laura wrote to Tom about her feelings, about how hard it was for her to hide their relationship from her husband, and about how she dreamed of the day when they could be together openly. Mark felt his rage gradually building, but he knew he couldn't allow himself to act impulsively. He decided to keep everything under control until he knew all the details. From that moment on, his life became a game in which he intended to win by exposing the lies that were tearing his marriage apart. However, Mark had no idea that his own actions would set off a chain of events that would lead to a tragedy far greater than he could have imagined. August 2002. It had been a few days since Mark first discovered Laura's affair. Those days dragged on endlessly, and every moment spent near her felt like a lie. Mark realized he couldn't just let this go, but he also didn't want to act rashly. He was consumed by a desire to know all the details so that these manipulations were causing Laura to become increasingly tense. She grew irritable and nervous, while Mark, on the other hand, remained calm, watching her struggle to maneuver through the difficult situations he set up. This game brought him a certain sense of satisfaction. He was in control, and Laura had no idea she had already been exposed. During this time, their neighbor, Walter Green, began to notice that something was off with Mark. He observed that Mark had become more withdrawn, interacted less with the neighbors, and spent more time sitting on his porch, lost in deep thought. Walter, with his keen psychological insight, realized that something serious had happened in his neighbor's life. One day, as Mark was once again sitting on the porch, Walter approached him with an offer to share a cup of coffee. Mark, who was already on the brink, unexpectedly found himself confiding in Walter. He told him about his suspicions, what he had discovered on Laura's phone, and how he had been following her. Walter listened attentively, and his professional interest as a former psychologist was piqued. Walter began giving Mark advice on how to handle the situation. He suggested not jumping to conclusions and to act cautiously, while also reinforcing the idea of revenge. "You need to act in a way that makes her realize just how badly she messed up," Walter would say. These words resonated with Mark, fueling his desire not just to expose Laura, but to make her suffer. With each passing day, Mark became more obsessed with the idea of revenge. He began devising plans on how best to achieve it, and Walter, without even realizing it, became a catalyst for this process. A strange friendship formed between them, built on deep mutual understanding and the dark secrets each carried within. However, Walter had no idea just how far Mark was willing to go in this game. This escalation of tension, surveillance, and psychological games steadily pushed the situation in the Black household to the breaking point, and none of them could predict how it would end. August 2002. Once Mark was completely convinced of Laura's betrayal, he started devising a plan for revenge that would be not just a punishment, but a true psychological torture. Walter, who had become an unexpected ally, eagerly offered his help in the matter. He saw in this situation not just a way to help Mark, but also an opportunity to fulfill some of his own hidden desires. Mark and Walter's plan became increasingly detailed and intricate. They decided to turn Laura and Tom's lives into a living hell, using psychological pressure and manipulation. Walter suggested creating an atmosphere of fear and paranoia around them so that they would begin to doubt each other and even their own sanity. The idea was to make them feel that they were being watched, that their secret was on the verge of being exposed, and that someone knew their every move. Mark began sending anonymous messages full of threats and hints that their affair was no longer a secret. These messages were crafted with such precision and care that Laura and Tom couldn't ignore them. They started to panic, trying to figure out who could have discovered their relationship, but neither of them suspected that Mark was behind it all. Every detail of the plan was meticulously worked out by Mark and Walter. They created a fake correspondence, supposedly from a stranger who had witnessed their meetings. In this correspondence, the anonymous sender warned Laura and Tom that retribution would come if they didn't end their relationship. Walter, enjoying the process, came up with more and more tactics to fan the flames. The messages Laura and Tom received became increasingly threatening. Mark sent them at different times of the day, making sure they arrived at the most unexpected moments, at work, at home, or when they were together. He used various devices and software to remain anonymous and avoid detection. Gradually, Laura began to notice that she was being watched. She saw strange shadows at the windows, heard suspicious noises, and all of this made her feel a constant sense of fear. Tom, in turn, started to become nervous as well. He didn't understand what was happening, and it began to strain their relationship. They both started to suspect each other of leaking information, which led to their first arguments. Walter convinced Mark that they needed to push Laura and Tom to their breaking point so that they would crack under the pressure and confess their affair themselves. This was part of their plan, to make Laura come to Mark with a confession, begging for forgiveness. But by then, Mark was far beyond the point of simple forgiveness. Over time, the messages became more and more sinister. In one of them, Mark wrote, "You think you can hide? I see you. I know where you are, and I'll be coming soon." Laura stopped sleeping at night, terrified that someone really would come for her. Tom tried to calm her down, but was on the verge of a nervous breakdown himself. Finally, Mark decided it was time to end the game. He arranged a meeting at his house, inviting Laura and Tom under the pretense of peacefully discussing their relationship. He told Laura that he knew about her affair and wanted to settle things so they could start fresh. Tom also received an invitation, but from a supposedly anonymous source who promised to reveal the truth about Laura. The evening of the meeting arrived. Laura and Tom came to Mark's house with different expectations, but both were tense and didn't know what to expect. When they entered, Mark greeted them with a friendly smile, offering to sit down and discuss everything like adults. Laura tried to start the conversation, but Tom noticed something strange in Mark's eyes, something that made him wary. Suddenly, as Mark began talking about how their relationship could affect their lives, Tom pulled out a gun from his pocket. He had suspected something was wrong and was prepared to defend himself. Mark, caught off guard, realized that his plan was going off the rails. The room fell into a tense silence, with the threat hanging heavily in the air. Mark tried to calm the situation, but Tom was on edge. Laura, seeing the weapon, panicked and began pleading with Tom to put the gun away. Mark understood that one wrong move could lead to tragedy. He hadn't anticipated this turn of events, and now his life depended on Tom's next move. The tension in the room was escalating by the second. Mark tried to keep talking, hoping he could convince Tom to lower the gun. But Tom, feeling cornered, grew even more aggressive. Mark realized that everything had spiraled out of control and that he was no longer in command of the situation. Suddenly, something completely unexpected happened. At the height of the tension, Walter, who had been watching from outside, decided to intervene. He burst into the house, hoping to stop Tom, but his sudden appearance only made things worse. In a panic, Tom fired the gun, and the bullet struck Laura, who was standing closest. Laura collapsed to the floor, blood pouring from her wound. Mark froze, unable to believe his eyes. Chaos erupted in the room as panic set in, and Tom, realizing what he had done, bolted for the door. Mark tried to help Laura, but her wounds were fatal. The situation had spiraled into a nightmare that no one could have anticipated. Mark, realizing that his plan had destroyed everything he once loved, knelt beside his dying wife, understanding that his quest for revenge had led to a tragedy that could never be undone. The night of October 12, 2002, chaos reigned in Mark Black's home. Tom Henderson, feeling threatened, had drawn a gun, but instead of using it to protect himself, he accidentally shot Laura. She fell to the floor, bleeding profusely in a state of shock. Seeing his wife covered in blood, Mark was immediately overcome by a surge of adrenaline and fear. Tom, realizing what he had done, tried to flee, but Mark, driven by instinct and fury, tackled him. They engaged in a violent struggle, which ended with Mark grabbing a kitchen knife in self-defense and stabbing Tom several times in the chest. Tom died instantly, collapsing next to the still-breathing Laura. At that moment, Walter Green, the neighbor and former psychologist, suddenly appeared in the house. He had been observing the situation from outside and decided to intervene when he heard the screams and saw Laura had been injured. But instead of helping, Walter revealed his true nature. All this time, he had only pretended to be a kindly old man, while in reality, he had long harbored dark desires. Walter, coldly assessing the situation, realized that Mark was now in his hands. He saw in Mark the perfect partner to help him realize his most terrifying fantasies. Approaching Laura, who despite her wounds was trying to crawl toward the door, Walter cruelly told Mark, "You need to finish this. She's seen too much." Mark, stunned by the events, was in a state of shock, but under Walter's pressure and influence, he did the unthinkable. He approached Laura, who by then realized that her husband was no longer the man she once knew. With a weakening voice, Laura tried to plead with Mark to stop, But Walter, not allowing her to finish, compelled Mark to deliver the final, fatal blow. Like in a dream, Mark did as Walter instructed. Laura took her last breath, and silence fell over the house, now drenched in blood and horror. Walter stood beside Mark, seemingly satisfied with his devious plan. For the first time in his life, Mark felt he had completely lost control, becoming a puppet in the hands of someone he had trusted. Realizing what they had done, Mark and Walter began devising a plan to cover their tracks. Walter, with icy calm, explained to Mark what needed to be done to ensure no one would suspect their involvement in the murders. The first thing they did was meticulously clean the house of any blood traces, using chemicals Walter had brought with him. Anything that could hint at a struggle or violence was removed. Then they wrapped Laura and Tom's bodies in old sheets to avoid leaving fingerprints or fibers. After cleaning the crime scene, Walter suggested they take the bodies to a forest outside Woodland Hills, to a place he had known for a long time. It was a secluded area where few people ventured, making it an ideal spot to bury the bodies. Late that night, under the cover of darkness, Mark and Walter loaded the bodies into Mark's trunk. They drove out of town, heading towards the forest. The road was deserted, and every sound in the night made Mark jumpy. Walter, on the other hand, remained calm and confident in every move. When they reached the spot, Walter directed Mark where to dig. At this moment, Mark truly comprehended the horror of his situation. He knew he could no longer turn back, but the thoughts of having just killed his wife and her lover haunted him. Walter, noticing his state, approached him and said, "You're one of us now, Mark. You can't go back to your old life." They buried the bodies and disguised the site so that no one would suspect anything had happened there. Walter assured Mark that there were no traces left and that no one would ever discover what had occurred that night. Returning home, they double-checked the house for any remaining evidence and ensured everything was perfectly concealed. At dawn, as Woodland Hills began to wake, Mark and Walter, exhausted but satisfied with their work, returned to their normal routines. But from that moment on, their lives would never be the same. The memory of that dreadful night, when they crossed a line from which there was no return, was permanently etched into their minds. October 22nd, 2002. Just over a week had passed since Laura and Tom disappeared. The neighbors, concerned about the sudden silence around the Blacks' home, began asking questions. Among them was an old acquaintance of Walter Green, Ms. Jenkins, who often saw Laura gardening in the yard and always greeted the neighbors warmly. Laura and Tom's sudden absence became a topic of conversation at the local cafe, and it didn't go unnoticed by the police. A few days after the disappearance, detectives received their first anonymous tip, reporting strange circumstances at the Black household. The police responded quickly, and detectives began their investigation. When they arrived at the house, they were greeted by Walter, who offered his help in the search, showing genuine concern for his neighbors. He insisted he had no suspicions and only wanted to help find the missing people. Mark, following Walter's advice, also decided to behave as though he was an innocent man. He agreed to cooperate with the police, gave them access to the house, and actively participated in the search. However, the detectives, experienced in their field, immediately noticed his nervousness and trembling voice. During the search of the house, the police noticed some odd details. In one of the closets, they found pieces of rope that looked like they had been recently used. Additionally, in the garage, they discovered a pile of dirt left on a shovel, even though no gardening work had been done in recent weeks. These small but significant clues began to form a picture that didn't match Mark and Walter's version of events. October 27, 2002. Mark, who had been diligently playing the role of an innocent husband for several days, began to feel intense psychological pressure. Every knock at the door, every glance from a passerby seemed to him like a sign that the police were about to unravel their secret. He stopped sleeping at night, waking up more and more often from nightmares in which he saw the faces of Laura and Tom, demanding justice. Throughout this time, Walter remained calm. He reassured Mark that everything was under control and that the most important thing was not to panic. He taught Mark to control his emotions, but this only exacerbated his condition. Soon, Mark began to doubt whether he should trust Walter at all. He felt his sanity slowly crumbling under the weight of guilt and fear. During one of the police's routine visits, Mark nearly confessed, but stopped himself at the last moment, recalling Walter's warnings. However, his behavior did not go unnoticed by the detectives. They observed his anxiety, which only heightened their suspicions. October 30th, 2002. As detectives continued to investigate the backgrounds of neighbors and people who might be connected to the missing persons, they stumbled upon an intriguing detail. It turned out that Walter Green, who had always seemed quiet and harmless, had a dark past that no one in Woodland Hills knew about. Walter had previously been involved in a series of violent crimes in a neighboring state, but due to a lack of evidence, the cases had been closed. This information drastically shifted the course of the investigation. Detectives began considering the possibility that Walter might not just be a witness or a helper in the search, but a key figure in the disappearance of Laura and Tom. With each new interrogation, the police increased pressure on Walter, trying to get him to crack. At the same time, they continued to monitor Mark, understanding that his mental state could play a crucial role in solving the case. The unexpected revelation about Walter's past not only shifted the focus of the investigation, but also began to undermine his influence over Mark. When Mark learned this information, he realized that his ally had been manipulating him all along, exploiting his fears and weaknesses. This realization could have been the final push for him to finally reveal the truth. But Walter, sensing that he was losing control, decided to take decisive action to maintain his grip on the situation. November 5th, 2002. A few days after the discovery of Walter's dark past, the pressure on Mark reached its peak. Overcome with extreme anxiety and paranoia, Mark finally decided to betray his accomplice, realizing that Walter had only been using him for his own purposes. One evening when Walter came to his house, Mark suddenly grabbed his hand and with desperation in his eyes declared that he could no longer take it and was going to tell the police everything. Walter, unprepared for such betrayal, lost control of the situation. For the first time, he showed genuine panic, realizing that Mark was ready to blow their cover. But Mark was already beyond stopping. He contacted the detectives to confess the whole truth. The next day, the police arrested Walter after hearing Mark's account of how he had been drawn into the dark plan. November 25th, 2002. The trial for the murders of Laura and Tom began with great public interest. The town of Woodland Hills held its breath in anticipation. On the stand were Mark and Walter, two men whose fates had become intertwined in this grim story. The prosecutor charged them both, accusing them of conspiring to commit murder. Under pressure from his attorneys, Mark presented himself in court as a victim of Walter's manipulation. He claimed that his mental state had been compromised under Walter's influence, who had used him to fulfill his own dark fantasies. Mark admitted to killing Tom in self-defense, but insisted that Laura's murder was Walter's doing. Walter, on the other hand, tried to shift all the blame onto Mark, claiming that he acted on his own volition. He portrayed Mark as a weak-willed person driven by jealousy and hatred. The judge and jury faced the difficult task of determining who was telling the truth. Each day of the trial brought new details and revelations. Witnesses recalled how Walter and Mark had often interacted in the months leading up to the murders, but no one had suspected that their friendship could lead to such tragic consequences. Psychologists brought in for the case confirmed that Mark could have been susceptible to manipulation, but also pointed to his internal struggle, which led to his fatal decisions. December 10th, 2002. The trial lasted several weeks with tension building each day. Finally, after long deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict. Mark was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the deaths of Laura and Tom. However, considering mitigating circumstances and his psychological state, the court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. The judge noted that while Mark was a victim, he was not absolved of responsibility for his actions. Walter, however, received a life sentence for his past crimes, which had come to light during the investigation. His dark past was finally exposed, and the court deemed him a serious threat to society. The verdict elicited mixed reactions, ranging from relief to shock. The town of Woodland Hills was shaken by what had transpired in their once peaceful community. 2003 year, Mark began serving his sentence. In prison, he faced the painful realization that his life was completely destroyed. Every night, he was tormented by nightmares in which he relived the moments of the murders over and over again. At times, he could still hear Walter's voice, haunting him even behind bars. Psychologists working with him noticed that Mark was increasingly withdrawing into himself, losing touch with reality. He realized that in trying to avoid betrayal by Laura, he had become the very person he despised. 2005-year Walter, serving his life sentence, received a letter one day that shocked him. The letter claimed that someone else had been involved in the crime, suggesting that another unknown figure was behind the events in Woodland Hills. The letter hinted that the story was far from over, and that the truth might be much more complicated than it first appeared. Mark, who was released years later, decided to investigate. Burdened by the weight of his actions, he began a new inquiry to understand what really happened. This new purpose became the driving force of his life, and he set out on a journey that might uncover new secrets left unresolved. Will Mark and Walter find the answers they seek, or will their past remain forever shrouded in darkness?